I'm hoping for a sort of two-folded relevance of what I'm going to talk about, because we've been talking about influences and how artists form and their constructive years. So I'm talking about influences and anti-influences, which I think are a very strong part of that. But I'm also sort of mapping this kind of linear biographical development of an artist onto art history, and sort of there are parallels to be drawn between those activities, I think. And in an effort to retain your attention, I've got some props as well, so hopefully I'll get onto those. So, in this paper, I want to consider artists' interest in ancient art, and particularly what was going on in More's formative years in terms of artists' taste and distaste for the antique. Lately, I've been looking at classical sculpture in 20th century pedagogy, where it mostly took the form of plaster casts from the antique, ubiquitous in art schools and museum collections. These had become a working vocabulary of art education. Students had to progress through the antique room full of classical casts before graduating to the life room. Casts were also a critical element of assessment, so they contributed to objective values, both through being viewed as exemplary forms and through ensuring that everyone depicted the same subject in exams. So this species of Greco-Roman classical sculpture is what I mean by the old. And here are some images from art schools in the first decades of the 20th century. John Updike wrote a fictionalized account of the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford somewhat later on, where he described these casts when they were crowded together as a petrified riot. And I think when you look at some of these images, you realize quite how vivid that description is. So I'll just run through some of these images. Northampton in 1920, Portsmouth in 1908, Liverpool in 1910, Glasgow School of Art around 1900, Newcastle in 1920, So this actually comes from a publication called Every Woman's Encyclopedia, which ran between 1910 and 1913 and had this amazing segment of art schools. Which art schools should you go to? And in those profiles of various art schools, there are some quite good images, including this one. It says the school is exceptionally well equipped with casts of the best classical sculpture. And my point, I suppose, is that that's not at all true, because it's not exceptional. You look through these and you realise, like, when you've seen one cast room, you've kind of seen them all, which I think is the point. And collectively, these images hopefully convey the sheer presence of the old. Certainly, as far as education was concerned, classicism was ubiquitous. Hence, in the book Henry Moore at the British Museum, we find Moore recalling, in the 1920s, I had to get away from the emphasis on classical art, which we had all around us at an art school. So the new old looked away from the classical canon towards other sculptural idioms. When Henry Moore listed the great sculptures of the sculpture of the world in 1935, he disregarded classical sculpture. It was Sumerian, early Greek, Etruscan, ancient Mexican, 4th and 12th dynasty Egyptian, Romanesque and early Gothic that he took to be the summit of sculptural achievement, not these overfamiliar classical Greek and Roman works. Interest in this new old is bound up with the waning of classicism. They're two sides of the same coin, but it's the decline I want to focus on today, partly because the ascent of the new idiom is so well covered in the exhibition catalogue, so I didn't have anything to add. And signs of this decline came sooner than you might think. Although the real landslide against antiquity in art schools occurred mostly around the middle of the 20th century, earlier examples can be found. For instance, there's a very peculiar passage in a local newspaper, the Sheffield Independent of August 1906, titled "The Gods Complain," which is an account of a cast room voiced by the casts themselves. So Venus de Milo, speaking in the first person, mournfully describes being among great piles of rubbish, broken plaster and dust. The room looked like the ruins of a sacked mansion. The Venus de Medici complains that she hasn't seen Vulcan for a while. They've stuck him up somewhere outside, and he's there night and day in all weathers. And Antinous is languidly chewing a cigarette, having picked up smoking from the art students. Although it takes a very odd form, this is quite a vivid suggestion of classicism's neglect at the outset of the 20th century, and anticipates some of the indignities that castes would be subjected to later on. Just by way of example here. So this is a little bit later on, but on the left you see some students at Brighton managed to get their Venus up onto the balcony of the art school, and in the local newspaper they got great enjoyment from interviewing the porter about how they'd get it back down. And on the right, those are students in Liverpool, and you can just about make out beneath all of that mess is a plaster cast, which I think they're tarring and feathering. So, this is quite a fall from grace, from objectively beautiful objects to be emulated into things to be, the subject of student pranks. So, identifying when Greco-Roman sculpture fell from grace is difficult, partly because attitudes towards the classical canon are frequently inconsistent and complicated. Picasso, for instance, obviously had a strong relationship with classicism. Just some images to make that irrefutable. The sleeping Ariadne next to the source, and the proximity of pose between this woman drying her foot and the Spinario. Yet Picasso also denounced classicism in 1935, warning of its seductiveness. He said, "The beauties of the Parthenon, Venuses, nymphs and narcissuses," you can't really pluralize narcissus, "are so many lies." So these kinds of inconsistency obscure any cogent narrative and therefore a real sense of causation. So instead of trying to isolate a time or a reason for this shift in influence, I'm going to run through some of the factors that contributed to the waning of the old. Collectively, many important ideological and conceptual transitions came together to slowly undermine the antique plaster cast. Or as Mary Beard put it, in relation to the cast collection in Cambridge, the relegation in status was, this is a quote, "the final symptom of a rather more epistemic cause." So those causes, I'll move on to another images because that's too distracting. First of all, posturing against authority has rich precedent, but was especially popular with modernists in the early 20th century. At a general level, this manifested as advocacy of the blank slate, for instance in Paul Clay's 1902 dictum, or desire rather, to be as though newborn, knowing absolutely nothing about Europe. But it also specifically took the form of treating classical sculpture without respect. James Joyce, in a dialogue in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, has the character Lynch talking irreverently about a classical Venus, exciting his desire. "One day I wrote my name in pencil on the backside of the Venus of Praxiteles in the museum," he says. And sculptors themselves weren't averse to saying similar sorts of things. If you look in the journal The Egoist, particularly the earlier volumes, it's just a real dense thicket of anti-Greek particularly, and anti-classical sentiment voiced by the likes of Gaudia Brzeska and his coterie. And there's also Hans Arp in the Isms of Art, published in 1925, which made irreverence for antiquity part of his account of Dadaism, which he said, and this is the quote, "had declared art to be a magic purge, gave the clister to Venus of Milo, and allowed Laocoon and Sons, or Laocoon and Sons, to absent themselves at last, after they'd tortured themselves in the millennial fight with the rattlesnake." This hostility manifested, among other things, an attempt to put distance between the artist and the museum, something Marinetti had famously called for in the Futurist Manifesto, with its ambition to free this land from its smelly gangrene of professors, archaeologists, ciceroni, and antiquarians. And these positions translated into practice. A rare statistical insight comes from the number of drawing tickets issued by the British Museum to art students, which dropped precipitously at the beginning of the 20th century. So having been around 15,000 a year in the 1880s, the number was closer to 1,000 in 1910. So Henry Moore, being such a devotee of the British Museum, was exceptional. And I realise, of course, saying this, that he went there to get away from classical antiquity, but I think that's exceptional too. I think most of these art students were probably going there to draw. I mean, how can we know? But Greek and Roman stuff. And by 1935, the museum issued only 518 drawing tickets to art students, which I think is interesting. That was the year of Herbert Reed's essay, What is Revolutionary Art?, which asserted that the cultural heritage of the past shaped the complex ideology of the bourgeois mind and got in the way of progress, to put it in a ridiculously brief thumbnail. The second, rather, to some extent, these contrarian impulses were a strategy aimed at achieving originality. Translating that from the object maker to the object takes us to the closely related second contributing factor, a preference for the original rather than the reproduction. Returning to the British Museum for a moment, in 1935 it dismantled its cast gallery after having begun to purge the displays of cast reproductions that were sort of spread throughout the displays. So in the 1920s, for instance, the Elgin marbles were shown as complete, with 40% of the frieze made up of casts. In the 1930s, only the marbles were shown, with the gaps reinstated. This corresponds to a surge in interest relating to the reproduction in intellectual history. Walter Benjamin's first reference to aura was in his 1931 Small History of Photography, and Erwin Panofsky had addressed the same debate in 1930 in his essay Original and Facsimile Reproduction. Both Benjamin and Panofsky were actually quite positive about reproductions, but their writing reflects latent cultural anxieties about them. And reproductions had more vigorous apologists too, among them William Rothenstein, who in an address to the Bradford Arts Club in 1912 had argued that they're much more adept at serving public taste because they could bring to the public first-rate work rather than third-rate originals. Similarly, in 1920, E.M. Forster wrote the essay For the Museum's Sake, which mocked any appetite for the real, for the authentic. He found museums' accretion of objects from so many cultures and periods silly, and the desire for originals in that context he thought particularly odd. So his essay comments sarcastically that in forming museum collections, it was important that they should be genuine old objects and not imitations, which looked the same, but were said to be discreditable. This was inconsistent, he argued, with the mechanized age they lived in. More than that, he cast doubt on the appetite for old objects in the first place, be they original or copy. Forster asked, after all, what is the use of old objects? They breathe their dead words into too dead an ear. Our age is industrial and musical and one or two nice things, but its interest in the past is mainly faked. And perhaps most pertinently of all, this sense of fakeness was central to Wilensky's 1932 book, The Meaning of Modern Sculpture, this is its third appearance today, which railed against what he called the Greek prejudice and the thinness of actual evidence to support the reverence for Greek sculpture. He argued our knowledge is precariously based on copies, fakes, and generation upon generation of restorations, pointing to the Venus de Milo's composition from fragments of different kinds of marble, and the winged victory of Samothrace being stuck together from 118 fragments. Elizabeth Pretterjohn has more recently made a similar point in The Modernity of Ancient Sculpture, that even objects that date from antiquity have a status which is probably the creation of modernity as much as antiquity. In this sense, these canonic objects weren't capable of originality because their lineage was so obscured by time. They're clouded by loss, discovery, and reconstruction, such that any semblance to unity as objects or certainty in status rests on a number of fictions. We can set these concerns with what was original against a wider landscape of improving technologies of cultural reproduction, which arguably superseded the plaster cast and helped contribute to a heightened awareness of the distinction between the original and the copy. I'm thinking of the radio. The BBC was formed in 1922 and got its Royal Charter in 1927. Or the gramophone record. In 1921, HMV opened its first record shop in London. And of course photography, with innovations by Kodak and the introduction of the Brownie camera in 1900, inventing mass popular photography. So to the extent that they might have been stimulated by these technological developments, debates about reproduction and the original quickly look like a reenactment of 19th century debates that followed industrialization and mechanization. There are strong echoes of ideals articulated within the arts and crafts movement, and their concern with mechanization, the individual's hand, ideas of sincerity, and so on. Ruskin's notion of the innocent eye, which he put forward in the Elements of Drawing, seems very alive in these discussions about what was and wasn't good sculpture. Reproduction via casts and print culture had obviously played a profound role in establishing a canon of classical antiquity. Now it seemed that these connections between classicism and reproduction, which had been so instrumental in its success, were the very thing weakening it against alternative canons of sculpture which hadn't been tarnished by infinite reproduction. Finally, a significant portion of this account of classicism's decline and depletion should be chalked up to accident and the vicissitudes of various players and institutions. One was the ill health of a major UK supplier of plaster casts from the antique, Bracciani & Co., one of whose catalogues you can see a page from here. Their moulds' deterioration with use meant that production became less efficient and more labour was needed for each cast. The viability of Bracciani as a business was wavering, and this vulnerability prompted a letter to the Prime Minister in 1915, signed by many prominent figures in the art world, the presidents of the Royal Academy, the directors of the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum among them. Their letter urged, "It's of the highest importance to the study of art in this country and our colonies that there should be no cessation in the work of moulding and maintaining an adequate supply of such casts as are required for the purposes of art education." Tacitly agreeing with those assertions, the state indeed took over, and Bracciani was absorbed within the Board of Education in 1922 to be run as a museum department within the V&A, called the Department for the Sale of Casts. A factor like this has obvious chicken and egg aspects to it. The business would have been more buoyant had appetite for classical casts been stronger. But I think it's a good example of something relatively specific contributing to, or at very least participating in, a much larger historical trend. Also, when we pause to think about the kinds of things, the kinds of functions that the state normally runs, infrastructure, utilities, and all those things, health, defence, taking on cast manufacture is an indication of how significant these objects once were. Then, of course, relatedly, I suppose, is the condition of the casts themselves. Henry Moore later justified his disdain for the casts in Leeds, partly on the basis of their poor state. He said, "Now I know that I was quite justified in not liking them, because besides not being very good pieces of sculpture in themselves, they'd been whitewashed every year for 20 years, and had a thick coat, nearly 1/4 of an inch of whitewash on top of them, which was blurring all the surface sensitivity and the form, but we were still expected to draw them. So to conclude, Homi Bhabha, in The Location of Culture, described the fragility of canons. What one expects to find at the very centre of life or literature, the summation of a great tradition, a touchstone of taste, may only be the dream of the deprived, or the illusion of the powerless. The canonical centre may indeed be most interesting for its elusiveness, most compelling as an enigma of authority. Taking this sentiment as a route into a conclusion gives us again the emphasis on fiction, the will-o'-the-wisp quality of things that appear certain. To the extent that classical antiquity seemed a given, it could be presented as reassuringly fixed and stable, and therefore an ideal foundation for education. But it's within this category of fictions that alternative canons begin to seem equally flawed. The new old and the old share in common a fundamental problem, essentially a preoccupation with origins or roots. In his essay Nietzsche, Genealogy and History, Foucault warned against the pursuit of origins, this bit coming as a quote, because it's an attempt to capture the exact essence of things, their purest possibilities and their carefully protected identities, because this search assumes the existence of immobile forms that precede the external world of accident and succession. It's an extension of the belief that things are most precious and essential at the moment of birth. This proposition is troubling. It feels slightly reactionary and UKIP-y even, to believe that things are best at their beginning. Isn't it again rather linear too, imposing order when our experience of time and what survives is as chaotic and accidental as it is designed, a characteristic which should discourage us from reading too much into beginnings or origins? Less abstractly, perhaps, drawing on alternative pasts was still drawing on the past, and as such would have offended the most strident exponents of abandoning the antique in the first place. I'm thinking of the Manifesto of the Futurist Painters of 1910, which said that the battle was with old statues and old bric-a-brac against everything which is filthy and worm-ridden and corroded by time. We consider the habitual contempt for everything which is young, new, and burning with life to be unjust and even criminal. If the concern shares fundamental flaws with classicism in its original yearnings, then it also perhaps derived its power from the same quality, incompleteness. In classicism, the fragment and the iconographic opacity of the imagery liberated it for subsequent artists' imaginations. The poverty of the object offered gaps for artists to fill. Likewise, the underexplored social and historical contexts of the art more now looked at. These deracinated forms were mysterious and offered space for contemporary artists and their imaginations, just as the fragmentary nature of antiquity had. The relatively limited writing on their contexts, compared with the vast literature on Greece and Rome, enabled them to be more formalist objects. Being underexplored meant they could appear universal, which is ironic in some ways, because incomprehensibility or inaccessibility had been an early charge levelled against plaster casts from the antique too. Fred Miller, in an account of his art training at the very end of the 19th century, said drawing from casts was like reciting a language one didn't understand. So to close with a couple of slides steeped in the vocabulary of classicism but very recent, the point of these is simply to show that the tide didn't go out entirely in this early 20th century trend. And lastly, I want to show you an image from a project by Rachel Sussman called The Oldest Living Things in the World. And this is a moss in Chile, which is over 2,000 years old. So it's an organic form that has this great historical lineage. And I merely put that up to suppose, elicit how emotive or how powerful the notion of a 2,000-year-old organism is, and how dependent on imagination our comprehension of that great age actually is. So in some ways, I suppose I'm saying that the inevitability of what we could call a narrative constructionism is inbuilt in our appreciation of anything from the past. And that is a problem, but also not so very bad. And prop-wise, you might like to circulate this. I brought this along because I was trying to think of having identified new technologies that eroded the success of the plaster cast by offering a competing mode of cultural reproduction. The 3D printout came to mind, and this, of course, is a Laocoon, so it has certain kind of iconographic consistency, and feel free to pass it around. And this also is a translating the idea of these classical things being pedagogic objects. I've made essentially a child's toy. So instead of shapes or numbers, you have these, these things like the Dying Gaul, the Apollo Belvedere. I suppose it's a one-liner about using antiquity pedagogically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Come have a seat. You crammed a lot in there, didn't you? I really enjoyed your paper, and I've got a very specific question I want to ask you. And just to give you a bit of a heads up, it's about that photograph that's in the catalogue of Christmas 1931 of Henry Moore in the Chelsea play, Christmas play, bare-chested, arms behind his back, wearing black tights around his forearms, body painted whitewashed, like the Leeds plaster cast, whitewashed, performing as a plaster sculpture. Very tantalising and interesting image in relation to what you've just said. To build up to that, just to hold that kind of image in your head. The question I've got for you, which is, feels to me that the period in which we're dealing with plaster cast and more in the 1920s, let's take it into the 30s as well. It seems to be a period in which plaster and plaster cast go from being a material, well, plaster goes from being a material of emulation, reproducibility, distribution of objects, through to a material of experimentation. So we think of all those surrealist use and Picasso's sculpture in the 1930s, where they're playing with all these ideas, often within a single work, and plaster is used to model, carve, cast, often within a single piece, and they're blowing all the poetry of plaster to bits, all its resonances to classical. So Moore's kind of, in these decades, Moore's relationship to plaster and plaster cast can't help but be informed. I mean, the Louvre plaster courts, what closed in 1927, with this kind of other contemporary artists' take on how to deal with plaster, the problem of the plaster cast in the European avant-garde sculptural context. And it seems to me, I don't know whether you agree, that Moore has a very kind of ambiguous, ambivalent attitude. Because on the one hand, all the things you've just said, it seems that he shares. He has a kind of almost atavistic respect for his ancestors rather than his elders. He's going back in time to look for earlier examples that kind of are older and newer, as it were. But also there's a kind of, he doesn't ditch plaster as a material. He doesn't ditch casting later on. He doesn't ditch an interest in Italian classicism. He goes to Italy and continues to, he thinks within the tropes and genres of Italian classicism. All at the same time that he's engaging with the new of the European avant-garde of surrealism. And so there's this very kind of complicated kind of love-hate, one foot in, one foot out treatment. And I wonder, to come back to the picture, and we've talked a lot today about the relationship between artists and their works and bodies and surfaces and materials, how you read that image of, I don't know if you've seen it.
Yes.
You have,
yes.
yeah. Of what kind of game is going on, what kind of game of identification, of play, of seriousness, of impersonation.
Well, I think it's a really fascinating image because, among other things, there's a huge potential for metaphor when you're talking about plaster casts and the idea of education. How teachers and pupils sort of shape one another, how certain habits are imprinted. I mean, the language is rich for interpreting that image in that way, I think. Yes.
I mean, I look at it and I think, in terms of what you've just been saying, is he showing himself up as a plaster cast to be mocked? Or is he certainly there to be looked at, and a sculpture and a sculptor to be looked at? There's a game going on there. But is he putting himself out there as a double up with the plaster cast sculpture as an image to be valorized, mocked simultaneously?
I assume
it's playful. It's a Christmas play, and
it seems in that context that it's for. Am I wrong in assuming that it's slightly ridiculous?
Well, I don't know. I, with all these, with the jokes generally, there's always a double. I think it's a very ambivalent, and it seems to point very specifically to the kind of the terrain of your talk, with, and also the difference between the cast and the unique or the handmade. The difference between very pristine, beautiful Bruciani original mid-19th century casts and really shoddy ones of OK works that have had layers of whitewashing, and his whitewashing his own body. Perhaps I'm just too sucked into reading too much into that, but
yeah, I don't think I can add anything to that observation, but
Hannah,
I like it.
I'll move on.
I'll just shout. It's a sort of comment on that point, actually, because it seems to tie in a little bit to all the papers, but specifically to thinking about what Kathy was saying, and this notion of a living sculpture and a degrading sculpture. And you pulled up this point about Moore with his hands on the sculpture, and here he is embodying being a sculpture. And also then this sense of decay and this sense of posterity, this sense of the antique, and this sort of, it seems to come in quite a lot, these whitewashing of the cast and their degradation and their kind of lack of form, and then this sort of eating of the Zadkin wooden work in the garden that's been, the bugs are getting at it, and this sort of sense of materiality, and I don't know, there's something about the physical embodiment of that, of Moore as that antique sculpture that seems to sort of snap us back into a present somehow. And do you see what I mean? In terms of thinking about time and thinking about how these works relate across time.
I also think it ties into a kind of an ambiguous relationship to classicism. I mean, when Walensky writes about Moore's work and the Sumerian sculpture of Gudea, he talks about it in terms of like the cloth. He talks about it in terms of a Roman toga. He kind of classicizes a Sumerian sculpture. He sees the classical in the Sumerian. I think Moore, to a certain extent, does the same. And these readings are based on the ways in which the work was successfully or unsuccessfully restored by Underwood, and what they did to the neck, and these kind of things. They're wanting it to be a kind of precursor to classicism. So there's a real kind of deep-seated belief in classicism, even though they're dipping their fingers in other traditions and other parts of the British Museum in the darker corners for their new.
I wonder if that's just an inevitable consequence of being so steeped in it. If the path of education has taken you through the antique room, then is it possible, even though you react against it, to
your tail is still trapped in the door?
Can I steal one more question? Does anybody else have a question? I was thinking about what you were saying, and something that's come up repeatedly over the course of the day as well, which is journals and literature and the publications that all of these artists that we've been discussing are looking at, and how reproduction in print may or may not differ, seems to matter hugely versus reproduction in this cast form. And to what extent is that to do with material and the sculptural quality of those casts? To what extent might it be to do with the content? You know, this is classical antiquity, and is it actually about reproduction, or is it about a kind of turning their back on these things formally, or turning their back on these things in terms of subject matter? Does subject matter?
Yes, I suppose the one piece of evidence that the subject doesn't matter is that many students didn't really know what they were drawing. And to go back to that John Updike thing, which is later, so it's bad history to use it too much in this context, but he describes drawing this Venus, and his first recognition of the Venus is that it's the logo that is on a pencil brand from America, I think. So he sees the Venus through this branding of a pencil rather than sort of appreciating what Venus is, or so I think there is a certain kind of, to some degree, they had been formalized by their treatment already. I don't know how many of the art students would have known much about, you know, the study of the story of Laocoon and his sons. Yeah. And there is potentially quite an interesting point of gender as well in this. In that there just isn't enough to know whether the male figure or the female figure was more sort of mocked in the art school, which I think probably was a bit uneven.
Martina?
I found your paper absolutely fascinating, and brought up lots of questions about. Well, I wonder if you could say a little bit more maybe about conflating the antique with the cast. And I mean, as you were talking, and some of the specific quality issues of the overpainted cast, whether that type of plaster cast and that mode of pedagogy, that version of antiquity leading to the sort of anti-influence of antiquity. But then also, if you could comment on the fact that it's not just the antique, but there are plaster casts of Gothic figures, of Renaissance figures, which surely were jettisoned at the same time in a similar way. I don't think the classical figure was picked out and jettisoned. It was that mode of plaster casting that was thrown out. So I just wonder whether the classical element is really a function of the plaster cast rather than an out-and-out rejection of the classical.
Yes, I think that's a fair question.
And just one more thing to throw into that, I'm thinking also of the other kinds of enthusiasms for reproductive technologies of works, such as the vast numbers of Elkington reproductions of works from museums around the world. The V&A had bought catalogues of these reproductions of medieval objects, ivory objects, etc. And that went into decline as well. So I'm just wondering what the bigger connections are to this.
Yes, well, I think the other sort of very popular modes of reproduction I think the decline was maybe a little bit later, and I see, acquisition in terms of acquisitions in collections. It seems like you stop buying casts, start buying reproductions, photographs or other types of reproduction instead, and then those fall out of fashion. So I think there's a slight there isn't an exact sort of fitting of the reproduction declining there. In terms of whether the casts, yes, of course there are casts that aren't classical, but I think just from the images that I've seen, the overwhelming majority of them seem to be classical. I mean, there are some Renaissance sculptures squirreled in if they look classical enough. And there are obviously lots of casts of Gothic material too, but in these art school cast rooms, I think they are principally classical.
Well, interestingly, the instructors and sculptors that were publishing some of the instruction books often use the Michelangelo figure rather than the classical, as Lanterie, Drury and Toft and people like that.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything other than the classical being set for exams, though. Because these exams were very specific. You know, you were given an instruction to draw the Apollo Belvedere from the sort of three-quarter view. So they were very prescriptive, and in those exams I haven't seen things that aren't classical being set.
I'm probably getting way too specific. I just think it's very interesting, the different stories that seem to converge about rejecting certain modes of pedagogy and certain modes of reproduction.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin.
I just wanted to sort of add to that the sort of surrealist appropriation of the mannequin, and obviously Jean Cocteau, Lee Miller as a mannequin, as a classical sort of mannequin, so in a similar mode to Moore, and also then the subsequent and rapid appropriation of the surrealist aesthetic by design and fashion, and so that it really within a space of years sorts of gets completely disseminated into a popular realm, so you get this sort of logo on a pencil idea. So I think that would have acted as an accelerant in sort of destroying the tradition and making it even more a subject of mockery for students working within that idiom.
Yes, and just sort of undermining its status as a high art object.
Yeah.
But also, just to follow on from that, Inga, think of someone like De Chirico, even earlier, who is mocking, but also he's opening up the spaces. We're looking at plaster casts always 100 removed from the original, but he's playing with those spaces, and he's painting the plaster cast which isn't of it. So there's a kind of postmodern revelling in the disconnect between the plaster cast and what it was referring to.
Yes, I think subsequent uses have to reference the reproduction in the. There's a self-awareness to them. They're not just appropriating the iconography; they are referencing the reproduction. I mean, the De Chirico with the glove, for instance.
Yeah, or the one on the Tate with the bananas, the 1913.
And also, sorry, just the actual production of plasters of late works by, certainly Hepworth, as a means of archiving, as a means of preservation. So despite the kind of rejection of the classical tradition, they realised that in order to preserve a 3D model, that is a way of doing it.
Any more? Okay. Thank you, Alex.